used to discussing, very much focused in a social sciences perspective, although from an architecture background. So I did my bachelor's in landscape architecture, then worked in urban design in Sydney for a couple of years, was generally pretty unimpressed with how Sydney's industry is structured and how it's delivering. So I then spent 2 years in Europe doing 2 different masters, which I've just gotten back from in urban management and development. So what I'm going to be talking about is aging population and its relationship with the built environment and place. At its best, the built environment is an enabling force, essentially. So an easy way to think about it is that the physical structure that you live in is like the hardware, and society is the software. And you can imagine that different sorts of hardware support or hinder different sorts of software. So for the aging population, for the elderly, this is very much reflected in their ability to engage in society, contribute to communities and society past retirement, and the built form essentially decides the degree of independence, not just once you're older, but at pretty much every single age. What is the built environment? Most people, if you think built environment, it's architects, and it's about making things beautiful, making beautiful buildings. And that is definitely an important part of it. It's also on that hardware concept, allowing and creating the space for economic activity and growth. You pretty much can decide whether somewhere will succeed or fail if you know what you're doing, which of course most of us don't, because it's an incredibly complicated process. It decides how you're able to engage with society. Is there space for people to actually express, interact, break rules, meet strangers? Can you gather? It's a place that, in the physical form, is a reflection of heritage and culture, and cultural identity as it changes through time. So it's almost the most human map of how changes in culture. It's also where an individual or groups can express their identity and cultural identity, should the space allow for it, on a human level. So when it comes to this concept of allowing someone to do something or not allowing someone to do something, there's a design principle that's usually used for making an object called affordance. Affordance is essentially, what can you do with it? What can you do with this seat? Well, you can sit on it, you could stand on it, you could throw it across the room. All of the things you can do with it. So that's talked about a lot with aging populations. Here's an example of, a barrier wall is created in design to also be a seat, but you can create it so that people can socialize. You can fit more people around if they don't all have to face each other, but you also have all the incidental affordance, so something being used for what it wasn't designed for. It also lets you then be part of a bigger picture. So taking a step up, rather than just an individual interacting with a thing, it's an idea of affordance on a greater scale. Can you be part of something bigger? Does the street afford you the ability to own your space in the street, or is the street something separate from you? So a lot of the pictures and examples you'll see are the old sort of European towns, and that's not any sort of bias toward what's pretty and lovely. It's because they were designed around the human scale, because fundamentally they had to actually let you live in that space in order to work, because it had less technology enabling different lifestyles. Outside of you and the object is also exterior forces. So climate is probably a big one if you're talking about physical affordance. Does the climate and the object actually respond to each other and allow you to meet the actions you need to meet? On a societal level, and in a wider design of urban environments, you can afford or limit the ability for society to express itself. You can afford or limit the opportunity for formal or informal events, activities. And this is particularly significant when you look at not just the aging population, but any population with a limited ability. Because all of a sudden, affordance isn't all of the things that you can do with it, it's also all of the things that it doesn't let you do anymore. So this chart is absolutely brilliant for expressing the concept of physical ability, and I think this was first created associated with disease or physical ability and disability. But I will talk about 4 different versions of ability. That's physical access, cultural access, social access, and economic access. From physical access, this is your classic. It's a wheelchair-friendly curb design. It's a very small detail. And then you have sort of the walkable streets. It's much more friendly to someone with lesser ability. This is in Barcelona, where street life and density mean you can actually walk to your destination. It's not just about the curb details, it's also about where the actual destinations are. The perfect street in terms of that affordance. Any transport option available, incredibly clean to visualize and understand and read the streetscape. But take a step up. This is Sydney. Affordance on this scale, and in terms of physical access, isn't just about sort of curb details. Because the great majority of our population is spread to a very ridiculous degree across this region. So for some context, that is about 60 kilometers in distance. And of course there is small local centers, but realistically the cultural heart of Sydney is Sydney. Maybe 1.5 Parramatta. Fun fact, Parramatta was once the capital of Australia. No one seems to know that anymore. But for some context of scale and why Sydney isn't really delivering the physical accessibility that it should be, at the exact same scale, this is Copenhagen. Our isolation means that we don't regularly actually see other cities for the scale that they are. This is considered, alongside Melbourne CBD, one of the top 2 most livable cities in the world. And in this region, which is the exact same size as Sydney, you've got multiple city centres that are each unique, walkable, identifiable. Where I just was in Rotterdam, this is part of the Randstad region, so you've got Amsterdam, The Hague, Rotterdam, Delft, all again to the exact same scale. You can immediately see that the distance it takes you to get to your city centre is so much shorter in this sort of structuring. So affordance happens on a much larger planning scale, and it's not effectively considered. London. So the population here, 8.6 million. Some context of the physical affordance that public transport allows is the bottom corner there. That is the rail networks, so it's tube and overground. And of course that's not considering all the other rail systems. You can imagine if I put the Sydney map next to it, and at the same scale, it doesn't quite match up. Then to reflect back, Sydney's population is 5.2 million over essentially the same space. But why is physical access important? It essentially is what allows you to engage in cultural life. There's a perception, of course, that an aging population, or as someone ages, they slow down, they're perhaps less involved in society, but that's not necessarily the case. It's entirely a reflection of an individual's choice, or at least it should be, except that sometimes physical environments force that on you. You need to be able to do whichever sort of extreme of engagement in society is up to you, and age is definitely not a barrier. I can tell you that by half of Amsterdam. They are far too much. The range of lifestyles limit. Right, so Sydney's sort of sprawl, it is sprawl, enforces sort of this other concept of cultural isolation to some degree. Because you have this population spread over such large areas, you end up with these really large islands of still multiculturalism, but culturally focused areas. Rather than having your daily walk through Chinatown, Little Italy, that sort of concept, you get in your car in your area where people are like you drive to employment, you only really interact with those that are like you. Cultural expression is good in that these spaces are able to adopt the sort of culture that's built up there. But with an aging population, you also run into some odd issues. Those that have decided to age in place, or essentially grow older in the same house they grew up in, may not suddenly find their cultural identity reflected in their surroundings. rather than being able to walk through that pastiche and still find themselves in that neighborhood but enjoy the benefits of multiculturalism, you sort of have these isolated islands of life. Oh, a very important reflection as well to take on to all of the future talks is that the future of the aging population is incredibly diverse. It is diversifying. So when you think about the older population now, it is not a reflection of what the aging population actually will be. Just a moment of reflection on the concepts of physical, cultural access, your average Sydney street, and the opportunities that it affords someone, or the lack of opportunities that it affords for actually engaging in society. Social access. So on a smaller scale, on a more individual scale, there's a range of those interactions that you need. That passive interaction by being able to walk through people that are different to you is very important. If we're talking about the elderly, then it's incredibly important to have different spaces where you can passively engage with society without having to actively choose to engage. It's very important for the multiculturalism. Malmo is incredible as a city because the centre life, which was very accessible, was able to bring together the huge influx of immigration that they were having with the existing community. And the discussion then around immigration was so much more nuanced and so much more considerate of actual experience because they had that passive interaction. There wasn't this wall, essentially, of lifestyle. I think the best example I've ever seen of social interaction in built form was Barcelona. In the center of the streets, they have these parks where the row of seating on one side was just full of the elderly, and on the other side you had dog parks, playgrounds, the whole bunch, and it created an absolute mix of people and lifestyles. In a bit of a comparison, this is the entry to an aged care village near Camden in Sydney. It's very pretty when the trees have leaves on them. Economic access. Like physical access is pretty deterministic of your ability to actually engage in society. It's usually how you would base your social interactions. Is it going to get a coffee? Is it going to the movies? Is it going to the opera? So the economic structures that are built into the physical environment are very important here. It's the ability to purchase. So while the brief of this course talked about how there's so much money in the older population, you also have some other barriers. Firstly, that money is definitely not equally distributed. A lot of the older generation will have limited financial resources. Equally, there's the cultural barriers then that are created. So the low density that we have pretty much supports a monopolized food system where you've only got Woolworths and Coles. Unless you're in a particular area where the culture is overrepresented, you're not going to get very diverse, culturally reflective foods. Past the ability to purchase, it's also the ability to be employed. As your physical capacity or your social capacity or your cultural capacity decreases, your opportunities for formal employment also decrease. And informal employment is incredibly important for people that can't engage in the formal economy. So on the street in Rotterdam, where it only was as dense as 3 stories high, but there was an old lady who had a walker and never got very far. But she would sit out the front of her house, and this street was created in a way where children could actually play in the street. And what ended up happening was, around her house was where all the children, or the smaller children, would focus. And so the place was covered in crayons and chalk drawings on the sidewalk, which was great. But the parents then were able to purchase the groceries for this lady that otherwise couldn't get to the shops. And you created an informal economy, essentially. The physical structure there supported a social network that was then able to provide support. This is MacArthur Square, Sydney Southwest, an approach from a residential area to the town centre. I think it's actually called the town centre now rather than the shopping centre. Who is the ageing population? Well, again, I've only really talked about people once they're old. But statistically, most of us age, and fewer, but still quite a lot of us are going to actually get old someday. So when we talk about the ageing population, it's not the people that you're seeing that are old now, necessarily. that girl is very much the aging population. And I want to go back to this chart because while what's happening up here is interesting, the actual value of this chart is about these lines diverging. This is talking about if a particular health shock occurs early in your life, but equally you could take this and apply it to what the built environment does to you. Does it mean you're in a car every day? Meaning that you're going to be statistically more likely to be obese, statistically more likely to have heart problems? Does the built environment limit your social and cultural learned behavior? So once you're older and can't access the things you're used to accessing, do you have the diversity of interactions available to you, or are you suddenly isolated in your house? So this is considered in Australia. Quite often there are incredibly good papers coming out of Australia. Heart Foundation in 2014 did a big pursuit of creating dense, walkable neighborhoods as a preventative medicine, essentially, to encourage incidental exercise. I think it was a lovely paper, and it was a brilliant event that was great drinks, and that was about that. I haven't seen it since. Granted, I haven't been in the country, but it definitely didn't come through when I was working in urban design. So the environment that we actually create for people once they're older is a great reflection of the failures of the general built environment. We create these sort of islands of physical access, where physical access is beautifully designed. So this is the neighborhood that my grandmother's in. No curbs, so that's great, you're never going to trip. Of course, you wouldn't really trip because there's nowhere to go, but it's a small island of accessibility. This absolutely gorgeous place is where they hold their social and cultural events, which essentially the aged care institutions have to manufacture because they just don't occur naturally in the built environment around this area. Context, as soon as you step outside the gateway to this village, retirement village, this is where you are. So the ability for that person to then actually experience society outside a retirement village stops there. There's nowhere to go. I think the train station's about 2 kilometers walk up there, and in an Australian climate, that is not an option. Of course, not everyone is in a retirement village. Just to give sort of a quick flash through, this is what we're actually building today. This one doesn't even have sidewalks. I was talking to someone who lived here. This was very recently built. They absolutely loved that there weren't sidewalks because nobody was ever going to stop in front of their house and make noise. Which is brilliant. That idea of dependency. So this is a statistic from 2005 on essentially where people are at the moment, dependency on a care system. And this again is entirely a reflection of the actual urban form and the cultural and social norms that come along with that, just not meeting the actual demand. So why this matters to society as a whole. As the population age distribution trends toward the older, inhospitable design to built form will become an increasingly significant barrier to the functions of society. The economic impacts that you create by limiting people's ability to engage, particularly if you have, say, the increase in retirement age. You know, if the retirement age is increasing to 70, how many 70-year-olds can drive compared to how many 50-year-olds? You're suddenly limiting a huge amount of people from the actual functions of Sydney. It is considered, again, this is a paper that's actually being worked on now. It's a very long paper, and I'm sure elements of it will be quoted to sell designs. It's the absolute classic picture. It's how I started mine as well. Old men on a bench. It's everywhere in the world. But we're not getting there. At the moment, the industry isn't getting there. So my brief for this was to talk about the complex industry problem associated with the aging population. And for that, I'll reflect on the industry and what is the barrier for the industry actually meeting the changes, because they're pretty obvious changes. All you have to do is see something that works and copy it. It's not actually that hard. One of the problems is that It's cross-scale and cross-discipline. As I said, it's the size of a step up a curb to the size of a step to your cultural center. Very few people within the industry actually work across both of those scales. It's also cross-discipline because it involves economics, it involves social sciences, it involves design. And I can tell you that the design processes of at least New South Wales training never really consider social sciences effectively, and economics is something else. It's a very broken up industry, and that's really limiting our capacity to actually hit those answers. There's a lack of knowledge in the industry. If I'd given this presentation in 2013 when I was doing an internship here at Lend Lease Communities, I would have been kicked out straight away because I would have told them that what they just built was damaging people's lives. And they would never have been told that before. I mean, they'll have been told off the scroll, but they'll have never actually been told the day-to-day impacts that the built form has on people's lives. I have a statistic that I was told yesterday, and I need to fact check it, but apparently 95% of the new housing stock in Sydney is builder design rather than architect design. So limited as it is for architects to actually know these impacts, a builder who comes up through a completely different education system will definitely not be exposed to the social sciences and wider societal impacts. So as an industry, the knowledge isn't where the people are actually building. There's a cultural lock-in. Try telling half of Australia that suburban lifestyles aren't good for them or good for society, and you'll get a slap in the face. It's a very assumed lifestyle, and there's a lot of associations of density, a lot of associations that I think, again, Australia's isolation, cultural and physical isolation is partly to blame for. But that has manifested in institutional and technical lock-ins. So where this sort of housing was desired, you've essentially over many years developed the economic structures to deliver this product. It's specialized in delivering this sort of product. And you get the planning institutions, you get the regulations, you get the standards. They're all based around this. So to change from this to a very different structure, even though it's a structure that exists elsewhere in the world, and in fact exists in Sydney, will take such a ridiculous amount of shift of knowledge resources, economic resources, that the feasibility scares people off before they even think about, should I do it? So the built environment today is very much delivered through market forces, and even though I've lost my page, there's a couple of important points I should get on this one. So first things first, when people are building a suburb, the target demographic in design is almost always going to be young families or young working professionals if it's an infill project. So when you're literally creating something purely to sell, and it's only to sell to a population that is a very limited scope of the population, you're naturally just not going to be effectively considering and effectively delivering for people that have less ability. The only time,
Don't you think that the reason why people don't develop for elderly people is because of the regulations and all the, like you said, like the curbs, there can be certain heights and all that. If it's an extra cost and a lot of extra time that needs to go into these things, and I guess money, like time is money, so these people want to put their money into something and get a return. So
and this is where the lock-ins come in essentially, because to shift away from that, I mean, it's not financially more viable to have curbs that are a certain height. That's entirely a reflection of the market structure around it. It's not a reflection of the actual physical materiality, costs, or anything like that. It is the time, and time equals money, and people are under time pressures. And so to shift people out of that is the complex industry problem that you're all going to solve for me. So that would be nice. But no, absolutely. That's where it comes in. Market forces, meaning that profit is the drive, meaning that these interventions and innovations that are required are a vanity project or something to sell yourself well. They're not your economically feasible project that you need to keep pumping through. And that is very much reflected in the next part, which is Sydney, Australia has a lot of regulation, but we have very little leadership on a governance perspective. And that's not political perspective, that's governance. That's the people that actually work in the governance. So as a complex system, Because there's not that overarching actual planning and control, you end up with the most influential actor having undue influence across the entire process. So they pressure the people that create the design to hurry up and miss those details that would otherwise be good, because your drive is now economics rather than what the system is supposed to theoretically be creating, which is the built environment that works for humans. It's also political. The industry is incredibly prone to political misinformation. Right now is a perfect time where the discussion is going, oh, is there too much integration and that's why our infrastructure isn't there, or is it because people haven't put in enough infrastructure? Everyone's just yelling at each other in whatever will suit them at the moment. And the built environment is one of those industries where everyone will have an opinion because everybody lives in the city. It's getting to a point where it's almost like an anti-vax kind of vibe. People really have their pseudosciences built up effectively about the built environment. Now, in terms of how that will impact the aging population across the city of Sydney, it's incredibly inequitable. Western Sydney is going to be hit hard. So I've got Copenhagen there as a reflection of a functional city. The northwest growth area, the area of farmland that is going to be developed in Sydney, is essentially this yellow triangle, the size of Copenhagen. It's not going to be Copenhagen. It will be inaccessible, inhospitable suburbia. Western Sydney employment area, which is going to be sort of your large shed area associated with the Western Sydney Airport, goes across there, down there, size of Copenhagen, and it's purely planned for employment. And I know that the politician that asked the planner to deliver that just said, I want to meet this number of jobs. That was the only thing that went into it. Southwest growth area, well, we actually have a town here that's about, probably about Copenhagen size again. No rail or anything. And the southwest growth area is filling in that space. So Copenhagen again. The opportunities, of course, there are incredible, because if you built an actual functioning urban centre, all of the inequitable access that people in the West have to the sort of cultural core can be met much more closely. So there's huge opportunity to find the solutions in the next little while. Fingers crossed. that's why I'm here. But Sydney isn't a lost cause. It doesn't take much to actually find the right thing in Sydney. This is just up the road, up Oxford Street. It's called Little Napier. Incredible area where people have essentially, I think it was a bunch of locals, through their wealth, were able to take the street back and turn it into what it should be. Down in Woolloomooloo is an incredible design space. It's a lot of social housing, so you've got quite a strong elderly population, close to the city, close to Botanic Gardens. It's really a great example of cultural, physical, economic access. It is currently under investigation, I think, for potential to develop. All of the classic designs, and again, Little Napier. The answers are there. They're not hard to get to. It's about overcoming those socio-technical, economic lock-ins. And to finish off, the story of the aging population as it goes forward is, again, essentially the story of all of us, because it's not just who is old now, it's everyone that will be old. It is how you age and at what rate you age and at what rate your capacity to engage changes. And equally, even if it is just people that are old now, it's the ability for them to engage with you, the ability for them to contribute to your society. So when you're talking about the aging population, it's very much a holistic consideration. Question time. Go back to a quick picture. That's a bit clearer.
Just in your opinion as to like the best solution to this problem, do you think that like expanding out and kind of having better infrastructure and creating like more like terrace housing and closer housing together, but expanding outwards in that, or like segmenting kind of like what Copenhagen and those sort of cities do is a better or more viable option?
I think the opportunity to segment into distinct cities is gone for Sydney. I think Sydney is going to be a metropolitan region city. It's that scale. The current plan is the 3 cities plan. Well, sort of happens every couple of years by political differences, but right now it's about the Badgerys Creek Airport city being developed, Parramatta City being developed, and then Sydney being the city. So it's about creating distinct cities. In terms of the infrastructure element of that and the density associated with it, I think there's, again, misinformation. So right now we're seeing a lot of density being put up around train stations, but that is sort of this much of that much that you need to understand when doing that, because those train stations are already over capacity, more often than not. I've worked on a project where the planning department could not tell me why we were actually looking at this site, because no piece of transport worked there already, it was already gone. And the density that we are developing isn't particularly friendly, it turns people off density as soon as they see it. The infrastructure, so in the Netherlands they've got a principle called project and provide, which is essentially just the process of the government works out what population they're going to have, what they'll need, they work out where it is, they work out what employment will be available to them, they put the infrastructure in first, if it's not already on an infrastructure sort of system, and then development can come in and do it. We are not doing that. I think the growth areas are going to happen. Those deals were made 10 years ago. That's the sort of timescale of these things. There could be a shift in sort of market perception. Every urban designer and developer will tell you the market wants, so that's what we have to do. Oh, we wish we could change it. So I think perhaps if there was a shift in cultural understanding of how the built environment impacts, then there's an option there.
One of the hardest things with like the built environment is that once you do it, it's hard to change it, and it's really hard to correct past mistakes. So I think like the graphics that you just showed us, like a representation of the mindset that we're going to expand now, like the Sydney context.
Yeah.
We're going to expand the whole kind of western region. We're going to try again and try and get it right. But doesn't that defeat the whole purpose, which is to get that social, cultural, like economic access?
Yeah.
So I was going to ask, like, is there kind of like a mindset, a kind of like group of people like yourself who are like studying and kind of coming into the industry that are thinking about how can we actually like focus on that central part now and fix it?
So there is a lot more happening in terms of infill and fixing up central areas now than there ever has been. For all of its problems, the light rail and pedestrianisation of George Street should be great. It should make that actually a much more pleasant and accessible space. But I think the new growth areas that we're talking about, they're not producing the right solution. They're creating the same problem that we'll have to catch up with. The things we're doing in the middle of the city, even the metro, even though it's not a metro, it's a regional train system at this scale, that is not a metro. You know, where we're trying to backfill and fix up the problems, but the new growth is not putting your light rail system in first. It is still car dependent, it is still all these things. So yeah. And in terms of a group of people within the industry, that is my sort of next career intention. I'm going to go around and start talking to people and finding out what is there, because I don't know if the state of knowledge in Sydney is at that point, or if it is, then it's just not hitting where it needs to hit.
And that's the issue. The only way to kind of fix that is like if you had a body of people like yourself who respected enough and known enough about this issue to say like, no, like you're just stupid.
Getting
Like,
respected.
put it in one word.
Yeah.
Like, it just won't work.
Yeah. Getting respected is a bit tough. Yeah. The media, you know.
Well, that's the issue. Because people like you don't have the money. You're not developers out.
Yeah.
Building developers saying this is what we're doing.
And if you talk to a big developer, they'll agree with you on all of this, but they'll just say, oh, market forces.
Yeah.
There's always, oh, market forces.
They can make the market force whatever they want.
Yeah, market forces can be whatever you like.
Yeah.
So in that case, do you think that then like an ideology
Ideology.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is what needs to change in order to like influence the market forces into then
Yeah,
actually
I think very
start.
much. I don't think we're going to see, well, we're getting bits of leadership from governance. The Sydney Commission was created, which was very, very not apolitical. I mean, Lucy Turnbull was in charge. It was apolitical, but it's not. And Lucid Temple actually has a great urbanism history, but it is still very much that political game. So ideology is coming at it from all directions, not just from what we should be doing to help people. I think the ideological shift potential for Western Sydney, where all the impacts are the worst, is probably making people aware that they're sort of being stuffed over. I don't like any politics of envy, but it works in Australia. The ideological shift within the industry, everybody already wants to do the right thing. Everybody in any office that I've worked in says, I know this project is bad, but at least I know it's bad, so if I work on it, it will be less bad than if someone else works on it. I've been told that by a whole range of people. So yeah, the ideological shift is sort of the problem. That's the question, how do you actually achieve that? And how do you get people that are, in governance, happy to just do their day job, not realizing the importance of their job, to actually push for it? How do you get people that, because it's not necessarily a career or a passion for people who work in the industry, it's a job. They just happen to fall into it. There's no reason that most people, like I said, 95% of the housing apparently is built by builders. There's no reason the builders have been made aware of these things. It's definitely not on them. It's sort of one of those things, no one's to blame, but the entire industry is to blame. Yeah, you can't, do you blame someone for what they don't know? Or do they feel disempowered to change? Yeah, the ideology question is tough, and that's hopefully what we're going to be starting to get into in Sydney very soon.
So just another one. So obviously you've studied in Europe,
Yeah.
and you would have dealt with the same, I guess, people, the same job description here. So like, what's the difference? Like, why can't we seem to think in a way that they? Because they're still going to have the money, the doctors still have the money.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
what did you observe as the difference between like, the cultural mindset?
There's definitely a shift in power distribution between governance and market forces. We are very, very much at the moment like on the hardcore neoliberal side in this industry, which is good for delivering some outcomes. It's not good for delivering all outcomes. I think it definitely needs to be applied where it's suitable. Governance here is weak, whereas there it's quite strong. They are an active partner in development, whereas here they're sort of a bit more passive, giving just sort of some light regulation or ticking boxes. That's probably the biggest difference immediately. There's also the actual market expectation. People there are aware that walking and biking to the shops is a nice experience. Most people here think that that is a daydream. We sort of treat other lifestyles like they're a fairy tale and not a real option.
So, I kind of come from a background of a few of the development sites you showed before.
Yep.
I think you might have had worked on one or two. But the one problem we've come across, specifically some work in my region, Newcastle, so kind of like same idea, or whatnot. There are 500 block subdivisions next to each other. And we're in a bit of strife at the moment because we're trying to put townhouses in, and it's not going down well at all. But with the pathways, we weren't allowed to put a footpath in. Still not entirely sure why. I think it might have to do with drainage. Yeah, that kind of thing. But what do you think the crossover should be between kind of like a more centralized approach versus local councils? Because we were one of those developments when they said that any developments over a certain value go to federal government, not state, and that was kind of awesome.
So there's two things happening here. One, the ability for local government to attract talent is such a widely universal problem that the UN put a report out about how local government needs to attract talent. It is a problem everywhere. So I know really brilliant people that do work in local government, but the local government systems as they stand at the moment are just ticking boxes doing their job more often than actually being able to engage in that sort of level. And here's a great example of where that sort of laziness gets in the way of the market improving a condition. In terms of scale of local government versus state government, I'm not a particular fan of the state government currently overriding local government on pretty much all development decisions, because the state government is the one that is pushing for the sprawl. a little background context. My mother is the mayor of Wallandilly, which is this area, so I followed that whole story quite closely for most of my life. But right now, their hand is being forced. The local government for Wilton, the one down here, is saying a great new town, no town at all. So they're saying infrastructure first, employment, all of those things, and the state government isn't backing them up on that one. So there's problems of corruption, 100%. I think that does happen in some local governments. It definitely happens in state government, and definitely does happen in some local governments. Scale of local government is a problem here. They're too small. The merging of the local government, I think, is something that was required to meet critical capacity for like actual ability to perform, but it definitely wasn't done the right way. It was done overnight, which was absurd. But yeah, local government scale is a problem, and local government capacity is a problem. And you essentially have on all of those scales people that do the right thing, the corruption. It's a mess. I think right now you probably have about 7 levels of government making decisions about Sydney. You've got Federal Commission for Sydney, Urban Growth, New South Wales Planning, all of the local governments, and then you've got sort of amalgams of a couple of local governments in the same sort of area. So, and they're all making plans. I can tell you, Urban Growth and State Planning will hire two different people to do the exact same job because they're the same role. It's messy at the moment.
So what's the current plan? I guess the federal government would have a plan for population growth in Australia. That's a good Australia-wide, but what's the plan currently? You said the state government is pushing for sprawl and local governments are pushing for employment. So what's the plan for as population does increase?
So right now, you've got from Commission for Sydney, you've got deliver a proper CBD here, increase Parramatta to be a proper CBD, and from there you would have some densification around there. From local governments, it depends on the local government. You've got Green Square is a pretty good development. It's scale for being quite dense. So City of Sydney is probably probably where you get strong leadership. In West, nothing, changed nothing. They refuse any sort of density, even though they're near employment. Don't know much about Parramatta. A lot of these places, again, they're like, oh, we know density is good in train stations, so they sort of let some shit happen. But, I know Wallandilly is pushing for, if you're going to develop, then all the infrastructure has to be there first. So they're not anti-development, but they're definitely not keen to become this. And it's a wider system. The Western Sydney employment area is where 70% of Sydney's fresh greens come from, and there's no plan for after that, so that's going to be fun. And 100% of Sydney's, or New South Wales, Asian vegetables are growing in the area that's going to become an employment area. So the system's focus here, again, it's cross-scale interdisciplinary. But yeah, across the different governments, federal government under Malcolm Turnbull was interested in the 20-30 minute city as a concept, which is you should be able to get to all your destinations within 20-30 minutes, which means putting those destinations closer as much as increasing capacity to travel. But he's gone, so I don't know what the new ones are. The new one seems to just be sort of blaming it on population growth through, which I mean, Rotterdam was the most multicultural city in the Netherlands, and it was where the population moved to, and they were coping fine. They were doing really well.
So a lot of the examples you gave us were comparing to European cities, which are kind of much smaller land size.
Yeah.
But if you compare it to North America or something like LA, are they having LA has really bad public transport? Are they having the same kind of issues, or is the society just dense enough that you can drive everywhere?
So we have a US urban environment.
Yeah.
It's North America, Australia, South Africa have the same suburban sprawl problem. The US has a slightly different context where the racial relations there meant that inner city became very, very dangerous, and all the economy left the inner city. We never had that, but we also got the perception of that from US culture. So we have these perceptions of the inner city that never actually happened here through the US. But the US has the exact same problem. They're facing the same problem. And again, depending where you are, some of them are being more active, proactive for the solutions. They're going to be facing the same aging population problem. And on your population growth question, Trevor, it's also an interesting one there with the immigration and growth of population, because as you have people hitting ages where they're less capable, in a developed country like Australia, your birth rate is quite low, and it will be decreasing as we get more wealthy. So you require immigration to meet the population that's shifting into unemployment.
When we talk about density, are you talking generally about, like, what's the balance between townhouses and apartment buildings and smaller apartment buildings?
So again, a similar thing to the North American context, the missing middle, and it's the missing middle that's really good for sort of age diversity population. Think your 4 through 7 stories. That doesn't happen in Sydney, really. It's Paris scale. If you think of Paris, still incredibly friendly. Paris was actually designed to have that social strata within one building, but Sydney either has skyscrapers or suburban, and we're starting to get there with missing middle, and townhouses are a great stepping stone, but with the population that we need to deal with, if that had all been townhouses, we'd be absolute great guns right now. At the moment, it's not going to be, so I think something more dense than townhouses is going to be required, especially if we're creating local economic activity. You can't walk to what's the phrase, inner city latte sipping. To me, that says a lot, because you can actually get a latte in the inner city because you have A, the time, and B, there's enough local economic activity to support a local cafe.